Today we're going to look at the context for exposure by Wilfred Owen. We're going to look at 5 key bits of context, which include Wilfred Owen's life and death, World War I, how the media reacted to World War I, and the state of the trenches. Now, Wilfred Owen, in his life, you need to know that he was born on the 18th of March, 1893, so that you can further look up information about the time he was born. He wrote poems that were primarily about war, since most of his life depended around war. His poems about war were from personal experience, and he was injured many times and left in terrible conditions in the army. He got shell-shocked and had to stay away from the battlefield for a little bit, which is where he wrote a lot of his poetry. Sadly, Owen was killed in action during World War I, just after he'd recovered from his shell shock and had returned to the battlefield. He died the 4th of November 1918 and was very young when he died. Sadly, he died exactly 1 week, almost to the hour, before the signing of the armistice, which had actually ended the war. After his death, as a symbolic thing, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. His mother received the telegram informing her of his death on Armistice Day, just as the church bells in Shrewsbury were ringing out in celebration. Now, World War I was horrific, mainly because it was a trench war, as in people fought on the ground and they hid behind trenches, which were large holes dug in the ground. It was considered a terrible war due to the weather conditions, the misfiring of equipment, and all the violent battles. If you weren't killed by the weather first, in this war you had to stay outside and not rest for long periods of time, then you might just die from being shot by one of your own guns as it misfired, or in the confusion and the smoke. The Germans liked to use smoke and lots of gas bombs in this era. It taught the world a lot about how wars were fought due to how horrific it was. The main way of getting news was through newspapers and radio. Televisions were around, but not everybody had one. Media were told to portray war as a very noble cause, so they were only allowed to really say the positive things about war. They often skimmed over the really horrific details in favour of not worrying or putting off the public. It was very important that the government had support for the horrific wars. So they chose to show only a few good things and very few bad things. Wilfred Owen knew they didn't report on the actual conditions soldiers were being kept in, which were they had to stay out in run-down, man-dug trenches for long periods of time. They couldn't change their boots, head for shelter when it rained, and they had to stay awake in case of an attack. They really started to suffer. If the cold weather and the frostbite didn't kill you, then you could get other horrible ailments, such as trench foot. Imagine that you've got to keep wet boots and socks on for weeks at a time. Your feet literally start to rot. Wilfred Owen was actually there in those conditions. Perhaps he wrote this poem to expose what the media wasn't telling people. So what's left? Now that you know the basics, I would advise you to go back over this PowerPoint and pick 3 out of the 5 key context points to try and remember. Every time you talk about exposure, try to include some information from one of the 3 things you chose. Do more research. The reason I gave you dates and times was because English revision can be quite literally you looking up context information. Think in more detail about World War One, Wilfred Owen and the time period he was born in, and the pros and cons with the media at the time.